came out to be baptized by him. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruits worthy of repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And the crowds asked him, what then should we do? In reply, he said to them, whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise. Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, Teacher, what should we do? He said to them, collect no more than the amount prescribed for you. Soldiers also asked him, and we, what should we do? He said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages. As the people were filled with expectation, and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John, whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So, with many other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news to the people. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
There are a couple of things I want to talk about before I get into the sermon proper today. One has to do with outfits. You may be wondering why in this season of Advent, when we have the blue paraments and all, and usually in blue here, why it is that I'm in rose and the rose candle is lighted. That's because in both Lent and Advent there is one Sunday that is designated as Rose Sunday. In Advent it's called Gaudete, which comes from the traditional antiphon that will be sung at the beginning of the service. Gaudete meaning rejoice in the Lord, our Philippians reading today. And it's kind of a breath from the more penitential nature or the reflective nature of Advent, the penitential nature of Lent, when we can just rejoice and lighten the load a little bit. But Linda Packard brought this today on loan from one of her Episcopal priest friends, and I'm delighted to be able to appear here in this beautiful rose chasuble. Well, I said one thing had to do with outfits, but I lied. 2 things have to do with outfits today. Those of you who were here last week experienced with me an almost 2-minute technological glitch when I had to fumble to download my text to my phone because it didn't appear as planned on the iPad. Well, on Friday night I was presented with a gift that had nothing to do with that glitch. It was purchased before all of that happened. And yet you'll notice it's sort of eerily related. Okay, I've got to read it. Moses was the first person with a tablet downloading data from the cloud. Yeah, that's exactly the problem we had last week. It wouldn't download from the cloud. So, this week I have all kinds of backups in place. I have my iPad, which at this moment is showing the text. I have my iPhone, which I used last week, and I have good old-fashioned paper. But you know what? That's not always foolproof either. I have been in situations where, particularly in the summer, you got a fan blowing, and one of the pages goes sailing off into the chancel at a bad time. Or at a church where there are two services, at the end of the first service, I've shuffled the papers, and I get up there for the next one, and they're all out of order, and I can't find my place. So we always have those challenges. Now, the thing is, I hopefully won't have a technological glitch today, but I do have a bit of a glitch. This one intentional. It's a last-minute switch of my ordinary and original preaching plans. And this switch was made because of two serendipitous events late last week. As I often do on the third Sunday of Advent, I had planned to switch today's gospel reading, which is a second Sunday about John the Baptist, to next week's story of Mary and Elizabeth. We missed that this year because we'll be doing lessons and carols next week. So I thought it would make sense to switch those, and that's what I had planned. Certainly, it's a sweet, prophetic story of two women's relationship, supporting them both in difficult circumstances and indeed validating each other's response to God's call. And it seemed to me that it would be preferable to the harsh words of John the Baptist that I just read to you about the brood of vipers and all. At least it's almost always preferable. But here's what happened. On Thursday, I attended my first meeting with the bishop and with the other deans in our diocese. We began with a reflection of today's gospel text and considered what might be the good news in it. I mean, the last sentence says, "So with many other exhortations, he proclaimed the good news to the people." Wasn't exactly obvious in a text that begins with John calling that crowd gathered around him the brood of vipers. Then, on Friday evening, at our canapes and conversation, I had a long and deep talk with two of our members. And I realized that perhaps I have not been as clear as I should have been with preaching good news. So today's glitch is simply that I'm not sure I have all of my thoughts worked out as well as I would like them. It's going to be a work in progress for a long time, I think. But here, on the day that's also known as Galena Sunday, or Rejoice Sunday, is what I have. Brood of vipers, John thunders. The gathered crowd was made up of lots of kinds of people who had come into the wilderness to hear this crazy man in the loincloth who was calling them to repentance. There would have been tax collectors and scribes, officials from the temple, soldiers, plain, ordinary people, poor people seeking some kind of hope in a world where they lived under the foot of the Roman Empire. People wondering about who John was. Could he be the promised Messiah? Would they have come out there in the wilderness to be told that if they didn't bear good fruit, they'd be cut down with an axe and thrown into the fire? Would we? In my conversation on Friday evening, I was reminded that there are those in our own congregation who grew up in Christian traditions that essentially treated them as part of a brood of vipers. People who as children were expected to memorize certain Bible verses and behave in certain ways, often avoiding many of the pleasures that their classmates took for granted because they were sinful. People who were told that there's only one way to understand the Bible, as the inerrant Word of God, where there is no room for thinking about what life was like in the time it was written, what it would have meant to people who lived in those times, and what it might mean to those of us living in very different times. So what we might consider a living word that continues in every age to inform and inspire us was really, for them, a dead word, frozen in time and place. Thus, a tool for determining who gets the good news while all others get the bad. Some are good fruit, loved and saved by following all of the rules. The others, they're to be judged and burned in eternal fire. Some of us here in this room have not only grown up with those teachings, but the teachings have followed us through our lives and will never feel good enough or loved enough. They are going to worry about that judgment and what comes next. Maybe they've divorced. Maybe they do not fit the one man, one woman pattern for marriage and procreation. Or maybe they wonder about their gender identity. Maybe they are, to all other people observing them, good and generous people who simply cannot rid themselves of those feelings and teachings. And I'm afraid there are many more who are not in this room or in any church space at all because they don't feel worthy or they have just walked away entirely from something so hurtful. On Thursday, with the bishop and colleagues, we looked more deeply into the text before us, looking for that good news. We looked at how John responded to the crowd's questions. The question, what then should we do? John said to the crowd in general, whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none. Whoever has food must do likewise. He said to the tax collectors, collect no more than the amount prescribed for you. And he said to the soldiers, do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages. Wow, now that's radical. He told them to be decent to one another, to share, not to take advantage of others. Just ordinary human kindness. Nothing about giving away everything you have or going into the desert to eat locusts and honey like he did. Nothing about staying away from dancing and playing games and enjoying life. As Lutheran preacher David Lose says, John points them to the very places in which they already live and work, laugh and love, struggle and strive, and suggests that these places are precisely where God calls them to be, where God is at work in them and through them for the sake of the world. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that there should not be teaching in the churches or standards of behavior. Not at all. In fact, this is why we need the church and its people as examples of how to live and be, even when we don't get it right. But I do wonder if the church has missed the boat when it focuses only on the scolding and scaring us into a narrow list of beliefs and behaviors, instead of treating us as people who can learn, be formed by seeing, feeling, and experiencing life. Be formed by the example of those who are not grim-faced, rigid, self-righteous, and judging folk, but by those who are warm and kind and caring, who struggle with life's ups and downs like everyone does, but seem to have a kind of resilience that comes from an assurance that they are loved by God. Being formed by prayer and worship and the example Jesus gave us. People who know they are not perfect, and yet they are loved. I also took a good look at the part of the text that talks about the winnowing fork, gathering the wheat, setting aside the chaff that is to be burned. Many probably read this in the same way as we hear the story of the sheep and the goats. Some are wheat and will be saved. Some are chaff and will be lost forever. What if, though, we thought of each one of us as a mixture of wheat and chaff, and that the harvester cleaned us up by removing the chaff, that stuff that gets in the way of our being our best selves, sort of like when we brush the snarly fur out of our pets and leave them sleek and lovely. Preacher Debbie Thomas tells us that judgment means seeing something very clearly. Not condemnation, but knowing it as it truly is. And the synonyms she uses for judgment are things like discernment and perspective. She also tells us that instead of waiting for a holy someday that will never come, inhabit the stuff of your life as deeply and as generously as you can right now. Share now. Be merciful now. Do justice now. Inhabit your life, no matter how plain, how obscure, how unglamorous, how routine. Why? Because the holy ground that matters most is the ground beneath your feet. The kingdom of heaven is here, within and among us. I look out from this pulpit at all of you, and I think of all that you do in this church, in this community, and with your families and your friends. And my heart aches for any one of you who may think you are not enough or who worry about whether you are loved by God. I know those feelings too. And I know it is sometimes really hard to accept and acknowledge the truth that you are loved, even with imperfections, even with needs to improve parts of your life. You are enough. You are God's beloved. On this Gaudete Rejoicing Sunday, this is the good news. Can you say it with me? I am enough. I am loved.
I am enough. I am loved.
Can you say it to each other too? You are enough. You are loved.
You are enough. You are loved.
Rejoice in the Lord. Amen.
Amen.